Hey, what's up? Jumbo Prey, aka Casino Crime here, and welcome to sunny Colorado, where we finally have an entire day full of cloudless skies and sunshine, which of course forces me to break out the shades to protect these baby blues. But more than anything, besides the fact that it's sunny as hell, I also wore shades today to talk about an important topic that I think that I get probably dozens of emails or questions on Skype every week about, which has to do with playing maniacs. All right, now one reason in the past that I've worn shades, and I think you've probably worn shades too, is to feel more confident at the table executing a bigger bluff or not giving off reads when you have the nuts. And I know the feeling more than anyone of getting, or the feeling of helplessness of getting run over by a maniac at the table and not really knowing how to adjust. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons people write into me. They kind of feel like they're getting run over. A lot of times it can be frustrating when you're playing PLO and somebody at your table's playing 75% of hands, but maybe they're playing some of them well, maybe they're just playing trash and getting lucky. And it can feel helpless because in PLO, people can have anything. People can have a lot of equity, so it's important to be tactical with the situations that you fight back. But what I'm going to share with you today is a few tips that I've learned personally in the last few years about fighting back against really aggressive players, which I think is more important as you move up in stakes. You know, at the lower limits, you can really get by sort of just avoiding and stepping back and not getting involved with the very aggressive players and just sort of feeding off of the passive weaker players. But as you move up in stakes, you're going to find that most of the weaker players' leaks have to do with them playing more aggressively. And you're not going to find as many, 65/5s anymore. It's mostly going to be aggressive bad players, and you need to know how to take advantage of these players if you're going to win money at the mid stakes and the high stakes and even the nosebleeds. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about today is actually seat selection. Now, when I first started playing poker, and all of the books I read and all of the videos talk about having direct position on the maniac or the weaker player at the table, and I think that that's only partially true. All right, in general, it's great to have position on an extremely aggressive player, right? Aggressive player, right? So I'd prefer to be in position rather than out of position, but I can think of actually a couple of other situations where I don't want direct position on the aggressive maniac, right? The first being, I actually would prefer to be 2 seats to the left of the aggressive player, or maybe even 3 seats. Can you think about why? All right, I'll just tell you. So one reason is because there's some very good squeezing opportunities. In fact, I found that most players respond to maniacs incorrectly, and they do that by calling more than they should 3-bet. So in many cases, if you're 2 or 3 to the maniac's left, you can find some good squeezing opportunities, which can be more profitable than just 3-betting outright if you have a direct position on the aggressive player. So let's say I'm walking into the casino and I'm sort of surveying the table and I'm trying to pick my seat, and I see a guy who I know is just an aggressive maniac. I usually try to sit 2 or 3 to his left so that I can set up these very profitable squeezing situations. But of course, if there's one directly to the left of him, I'll usually take it. Now, that's if you're playing 100 big blind stack or even deeper. And typically, I try to come in as deep as possible if I have position on the weaker player. Now, if I don't have position, usually I try to come in shorter. So let's say, again, we're walking up to the table at the casino, or we're trying to pick our seat online, and I know that a player is very aggressive. If he has position on me, I'll typically come in for 40 big blinds. And the reason I do this is because it creates profitable limp raising opportunities. It creates profitable 4-betting opportunities when we get 3-bet, and it just makes things much easier to play. So as a rule of thumb, let's review. It's actually in many cases better to be 2 or 3 to the left of the maniac. And if you happen to get the unfortunate situation where you don't have position, typically buy in shorter. All right, you'll save yourself the hassle or some uncomfortable situations later on. All right, number 2, and I kind of actually alluded to this a moment ago. One of the reasons why I advocate an aggressive style of play is because most players just adjust to aggression poorly, right? They either adjust by playing too tight, or they under-adjust by playing too tight, or they over-adjust by trying to out-spew the aggressor, right? So we want to avoid both of these situations. So another piece of advice that I can give you is don't outfish the fish, as I call it, right? If you see a guy at your table playing 60%, 70% of hands, the best approach is not to play 80% or 90% of hands, all right? Typically what I try to do is gauge how many hands they're playing and then play one rung below them, right? So if I see a guy playing 45% of hands, I typically try to play 35% of hands as a good rule of thumb. Now, seeing what 35% of hands looks like is a lot easier if you have poker juice or you do some homework on your own. But that's typically my approach, is trying to dominate them pre-flop. The easiest way to make money in PLO is to start with a dominating pre-flop range. And that's usually what I do. Now, when I pick a dominating pre-flop range, I typically like to play it aggressively if I think that I can get the pot heads up. So let's take a hand like ace 10, 10, 8 single suited, or maybe even ace 9, 8, 7 single suited to the ace. These are hands that, they do play well multi-way, but if a weaker player or an aggressive player opens, I may 3-bet those actually, because I just think there's so much profit to be made playing heads up pots in position with weaker opponents. So there's a lot of fuss on forums and in videos about the difference between multi-way and heads up pots, and I talk about that myself, but there's just profitable situations. There's just situations where you can gauge the profitability of playing a heads up pot or a multi-way pot. And in general, if I'm going to enter the pot and a weaker player is involved, I would prefer to enter it in a heads up situation, but you can take multi-way situations as they come. All right, another rule or tip that I have for playing maniacal players is to really pay attention to which board texture they like to attack. Now, even people who are extremely aggressive, they have their thresholds, right? There's some situations where they really avoid, or maybe, for me, I notice that it's board textures. Some players really like to pound paired boards. Some players really like to pound low boards. Other players, they really give up on heavier boards, which means like a king, queen, X board. So when I'm really, observing these aggressive players, what I'm doing is observing their tendencies on different board textures. All right. So I can think of one player that I've played specifically in the past. In fact, it was recently, and he's a big high-low player. And coincidentally, he loves these like ace XX or just like low ranking hands, and he really tries to hammer low boards because that's what he's used to. He's a high-low player. So I've noticed that I'm able to get away with some big bluffs on high-ranking boards because he really puts on the brakes on those boards. So that's just kind of noticing different tendencies and being observant of your opponents. All right, so another big tip that I can give you is to be observant of bet sizes. I think that the more hands that people play, the more difficult it is for them to be balanced in all situations. And especially if you're playing a very maniacal player who, again, is playing 60 or 70% of hands, one great way to get a read on them and be able to play a wider range or maybe even bluff them wider is to notice bet sizes. It's just practically impossible for someone who's playing that many hands to be balanced in every situation. So inevitably, you're going to find a good read on them. All right, so that'll do it for today. Now let's recap real quickly. In order to beat maniacs in your next session, a few things to focus on. Sitting 2 or 3 to the left of the maniac. Make sure not to outfish the fish by falling into the habit of calling too much, especially when you're going to have poor relative position post-flop. Be observant of board texture tendencies. Look for situations where they're attacking a certain board texture or putting on the brakes in other ones. Typical board textures where aggressive opponents are willing to put on the brakes are monotone boards or paired boards. Also, focus on playing a range that dominates your opponent one rung less than the amount that they're playing. This has more applicability in heads up, but it certainly has some usefulness in live as well. Don't play looser than the maniac and you'll be looking good. And also pay close attention to bet sizing tells for more opportunities to semi-bluff lighter or bluff lighter. All right, so these are tips that work well against maniacs that you can use in your next session to make more money against hyper-aggressive players. But of course, there's much more to it, and I go into much more detail in my courses, including Win 1K and Out of Position Mastery. Check them out at www.ploquickpro.com, and tune in next week for more tips to make you money in your next PLO session. Thanks, guys.